everyone, welcome to week 3 of All About Bannock. This week we are talking about our cemeteries. So we've had a few people suggest this topic and we get a lot of questions about it. So our cemeteries are definitely off the beaten path a little bit, so not many people know that they're actually here. We have 3 cemeteries. Our first one is the Old Cemetery of Bannock, which is way up top on this hill. And then we have the New Cemetery of Bannock, which you pass on the way into the park. And lastly, we'll go visit the Marysville Cemetery, which is further down the canyon. So we are going to start with the Old Cemetery. So we are here at the Old Cemetery of Bannock. It was started in 1862. So some of the oldest residents of Bannock were buried here. We do want to note that Sheriff Plummer and his sheriff's deputies were not actually buried here. They were most likely buried closer to the gallows. So as you can see in this cemetery, time has definitely taken its toll. Most of the original grave markers were usually just pieces of wood, like at this grave, but some of the grave markers have been replaced with actual stone, so those ones have remained. So as we mentioned in the town tour that we posted a few weeks ago, death was very common at this time. Between the lack of medicine and all of the diseases that would come through, the mining accidents, and of course the violence, death was very common. There was a family living here called the Keplers. They lost 3 children in 3 days to diphtheria in 1879. So there were doctors practicing here in Bannock, and even if one was available, they may not get to a patient on time, and because medicine at this time was very rudimentary and it just wasn't what it is today, there often wasn't a lot that they could actually do to help. So the first person to die here in Bannock of natural causes was William Bell. He died in November of 1862. And when he was dying, he informed them that he was a Mason and he wanted to be buried with Masonic honors. And on his grave marker, you can see the Masonic emblem on top. So when he was dying, they put out a notice asking any Masons to please come to his funeral to fulfill his last wishes, and a lot ended up showing up. Specifically, 76 other men ended up showing up to this funeral. So as we mentioned last week with the vigilantes and the outlaws, the vigilantes had this number, 3777. And of course we don't know its exact meaning, but another interesting aspect of this number is that a lot of the vigilantes were part of the Masons, and so we had 76 Masons show up to the 77th funeral, so there could be another connection there. And then they ended up opening up a lodge here in Bannock, which is what we now know as the schoolhouse. The Old Cemetery of Bannock was used for about another 15 years until the new cemetery was started, but there were a few burials in the early 1900s here in the Old Cemetery. And as you can see, it has not been maintained very much over time. So we are going to go look at the newer cemetery of Bannock next. So here we are in the New Cemetery of Bannock. This was started in 1876 or 77, and the last person to be buried here was in 1968. The last person was Mabel Ovitz. She ran Ovitz store in Bannock and was the last person to die in Bannock. She was driving up to her mining claim, and when she got out of her car to open up the gate, the transmission in her car failed and actually ran her over. So she's buried here. One of our favorite stories from this cemetery is of F.L. Graves. So Fielding Graves was a prominent member of Bannock. He was very big in mining and actually brought the first electric gold dredge in North America to Bannock. When he died in 1913, he was buried here, but in 1925, his casket was exhumed and he was to be reburied in Dillon. But before they reburied him, the funeral home checked the contents of his casket to make sure it was good to be reburied. And according to the funeral home, there must be some kind of mummifying properties in the soil here in Bannock because he looked the exact same as the day he was buried. So when you walk through here, the cemetery is completely full, but there are a lot of spaces that don't have any markers. Over time, families have left this area, but the ones that have stayed have kept up their family's grave sites, so there are newer headstones here. There are famous characters from Bannack such as Dorothy Dunn, who drowned in the creek. She's buried here but no longer has a grave marker. Here we can see the grave of the first person to be buried here. His name was William Peck. He died at age 38. He actually weighed 350 pounds, which was quite a feat at that time, and worked as a peanut salesman. You can also see the Masonic emblem at the top of his gravestone as well. So as you can see here, on many of the grave markers, family members will still come and leave objects today. So on a lot of the children's graves, there are often toys. On a lot of the soldiers' graves, there are often American flags. There are also coins or pennies usually left, which can signify buying a drink in the afterlife or paying your way across the river Styx. So when you walk through these cemeteries, you'll often see little objects left at a lot of the graves. So here we are at our third and final cemetery. This is the Marysville Cemetery. So Marysville started at the same time as Bannack. It was originally called Centersville though, because it was halfway between Bannack and the community of New Jerusalem. It was eventually then renamed Marysville after a woman named Mary Wadhams. She and her husband Wilson moved to Bannack in 1862 to mine. And she was apparently the first white woman to move to Bannack, so they ended up renaming Centerville after her. She and her family were very prominent members of Bannack while they lived here. But even after they named the town after her, she was actually committed to an insane asylum until she died in 1921. So neither her nor her husband are actually buried here. Of the three cemeteries, this is the one that we have the least information on. There's only a few grave markers left, and we know that there are about 10 graves here, but there could be a lot more because the fence that we see was not original. Thank you so much for joining us on this tour. Of course, right now we are closed, but when we eventually reopen, we would love for people to come out and visit our cemeteries. We just ask that you do be respectful, try and stay on the paths, and of course don't take anything. But I hope you learned a little bit more about Bannack and the cemeteries and the people that lived here. Thank you.